Okay, thank you very much again, Dr. Husky, for introducing me. You'll be learning this introduction by heart by the time we've finished here over the next few days. And I'm very delighted and pleased to be here. And what I'd like to do over the next about 30-35 minutes is give you a bit of in a sense of an unstructured discussion about the Israeli political system and about the big issues there. And try and weave my way in and out of trying to make even more complex what is a very complex topic. As Dr. Husky mentioned, we're just a few weeks, 3-4 weeks after a national election, and yet we still haven't got a government together. You know that when you wake up on the morning after a United States presidential election, the following morning, you know exactly who's forming that government. You know who's going to be the president. You normally do. There have been a few blurbs along the way. But normally, you know exactly who's going to be the president. You know exactly what the balance of power in Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate is going to be. Same is true of Britain, which has an election coming up in 2 or 3 weeks' time, because actually the system is not that greatly different from the United States system. It's very likely that by the morning after the election, we will know whether David Cameron or Ed Miliband is going to be the next Prime Minister of the UK, and more or less what the distribution of seats in the House of Parliament, the House of Commons in Britain is going to be between the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, and a few other satellite parties. In the case of Israel, you know who, well, you don't immediately know who's going to be the Prime Minister, but you've got a good idea who's going to be the Prime Minister, and I'll explain why in a minute. But then it takes anything up to a month, 6 weeks, even longer, for the coalition government to form. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to explain to you how the system works, because I'm not sure, probably, most of you know Israel from the big discussions about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the recent discussions about Israel and particularly Netanyahu's position on the Iran agreement, to which, of course, he's strongly opposed. But what I'd like to do is add some information as to how that feeds in to the system of politics within Israel itself. How does the system of democracy work? What are the mechanisms? What are the agents? I'd like to discuss the system with you. I'd like to say something about the big issues on the table of Israeli politics, which are not only the Israel-Palestine conflict, and you'll probably be surprised to know that was probably not the major issue on the table of these past elections, if only because Israelis at the moment, even left-wing Israelis, pro-peace Israelis, tend to feel a bit worn out, and they don't feel that the peace process is going anywhere at the moment, particularly in terms of what's going on in the wider region, neighboring states, Islamic State, the Iran issue. And so there's not a great deal of hope or optimism at the moment that some major peace negotiation is going to be back on the table in the near future. And there are a wide range of social, economic, and also religious issues which are very central to the Israeli political system and which are reflected in the way the system works, which were on the table. And if I have a few minutes left at the end, I'll say something about the major personalities, particularly about Netanyahu and the major opponent who headed the major opposition, or who will be the head of the opposition as he was for the past 4 years, Isaac or Bougie Herzog, and say something about the personalities. But what I would really like to do is put it within the comparative perspective and say something about how the system works. I have in the past taught courses on comparative electoral systems. And when I want to take the two extremes of what electoral systems are about, the good and the bad parts of electoral systems, because there is no perfect electoral system in the world, I take the two countries that I know best. I take the country I grew up in, Britain, and I take the country I live and work in and very involved in the political debate, Israel, because they sit at the opposite extremes of electoral systems. They reflect different types of political discourse. They give you different types of results. And each of them is criticized for not being what maybe it should be. And to a certain extent, although I won't pretend to be an expert on American politics, the American system, despite its differences, is much more similar to the British system in terms of it being a two-party system with single-member constituencies or electoral districting, which is very similar to the way that the British system runs, and it's very unlike the Israeli system. Let me, in a number of sentences, give you the ABC of how the Israeli election system works. First of all, Israel has a parliament called the Knesset, in which there are 120 members. It's a single-camera parliament. In other words, there's only one house. There's not another elected house. In America, you have both the House of Representatives and the Senate. In Britain, they have the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but the House of Lords is not an elected chamber. And in many countries in the world, you have two chambers. In Israel, you have a single chamber, and it's called the Knesset, and it has 120 members of parliament. The whole of Israel is a single, in Britain we would call it a constituency, here you'd call it an electoral district. There is no division of the country of Israel into electoral districting. One of the arguments over the years has been that that's one of the reforms that we should have in the system. We should have regional constituencies, and then we should adopt something like the Western European systems, whereby some of the members of parliament are elected in a national list, and some are elected from regional districts, but it's never been taken up by the lawmakers as such. So we have a country with a single constituency, which means that every political party has a list of candidates. How each party puts its list together varies from party to party. Sometimes a powerful leader will choose the list, and in the larger parties they will have the equivalent to what you call primaries, where the parties will come together and all the paid-up members of the party will decide who will be on the list. So for many of the parties, by the way, the most important election for them is the party primary rather than the actual election itself, because if you're a member of one or two of the largest parties, known as the Likud party, which is the right-wing party of Prime Minister Netanyahu, or the Labour Party, which is the left-wing party now headed by Herzog, if you can get yourself within the party primaries on the first 15, 20, 25 slots on the party list, you know that you're going to be a member of parliament. And of course, after the primaries are finished, all the radio and TV commentators will sort of make a forecast and say, well, such and such has been put in number 25 on the party list. Is this a real slot? Is he really going to have an opportunity of being a member of the parliament? So each party has a single party list, a national list, and when the day of elections comes along, every party, you go to the polling booth, there is a label for each party. You're ticked off on the National Electoral Register, of course, in your home area, and you simply take the label of the party that you want. It doesn't have the name of any candidate on. It simply says, it has a letter which designates the name of the party, the Likud party, the Labour party, the religious party, the Arab party. You take that label and you put it in the voting box. And at the end of the day, when the electoral booth closes, the labels of each party are counted up, and the number of seats in the Knesset are divided proportionally to the number of votes each party got. So if, for instance, the largest party, which is now the Likud, let's say got 25% of the national vote, they will then get 25% of the seats in the 120-member Knesset, with a minor exception, which I'll tell you in a minute. They'll get 25%. And if 25% of the seats, a quarter of 120, is 30, right? 25% of 120 is 30. Therefore, the first 30 names on their party list will become members of the parliament. The parties have to register their party lists with the Knesset so many weeks before the election itself, so there's no playing around with the list after the election. The list and the order of the list are the people who become members of the parliament. So as I say, if the Likud party get 25% of the votes, they're entitled to 25% of the seats, and they therefore will get 30 out of the 120 seats. The first 30 names who are voted in the primaries, they will become members of the parliament. Now that is what we call, as you're probably aware, a system of proportional representation. It's very proportional. There's probably hardly any other electoral system in the world which is as proportional as the Israeli system. And in a sense, you would say that's extremely democratic. Wow, you know, it doesn't work out that way in Britain or America because you have to win in each state or in each constituency or in each electoral district. And what happens in those countries is, of course, you theoretically, if you were the Conservative Party, I'll give you a theoretical analysis, which of course never happens that way. But let's say the Conservative Party in all 650 areas was to get 30%, and the Labour Party were to get in all of the 650 areas 28%. But under the American or the British system, what counts is the first past the post. The person who gets, or the candidate who gets, the highest number of votes, it doesn't even have to be 50%, but the candidate who gets the highest number of votes, he or she is elected as the representative of that particular constituency, that particular region. And so, in theory, if the Conservative Party were to get 30% of the vote in every constituency, but it was the largest number of votes in every constituency, they could end up theoretically having 650 seats, all the seats, but only 30% of the vote, whereas the Labour Party theoretically could end up having no seats with 28% of the vote, 2% difference. Of course it doesn't work that way because the country isn't equal across. You have areas which are more working class, areas which are more middle class, areas which are wealthier. The south of the country tends to vote Conservative. The north of the country, where there's lots of unemployment, I'm talking about Britain, tends to vote Labour. And so, of course, there is a distribution of seats. But nevertheless, there is not proportional representation. And the same is true, of course, of the United States of America, where there is no proportional representation as such. So in that sense, the Israeli system is extremely democratic. It's very proportional. There are very few lost votes in the Israeli system. The lower threshold for this past election was 3.2%. And that in itself was new. And until the past election, it was only 2%. And it was put up in an effort to achieve greater stability, which means that any party that didn't achieve or succeed in getting 3.2% of the votes, if you only got 3%, it wasn't enough, and your votes weren't counted at all. And there was only one significant party in the last election who missed out by not getting, by going close to the 3.2% and simply not getting enough, and therefore 180,000 votes, which you'll agree with me over a whole country is not a huge number of votes, were lost. They weren't represented as such. In the past, the threshold has been much lower. It's been 2%. For much of Israel's history, it was no more than 1%. But what that meant was that if you in the past could be sure that you would get 1% of the votes, or you were prepared to chance your luck, you could be a very minor, peripheral, esoteric party running on a very quaint or strange agenda. And if you think you could get 1%, you could end up with 1 seat in the Knesset or 2 seats in the Knesset. At least 3.2% is considered a slightly higher threshold, whereby you have to get about 250,000 or slightly less than that. And it means the minimum number of seats any party would now have in the Knesset is 4. But there are many arguments, which I'll come back to in soon, which say we should raise it even further than that. What happens in the British and the American systems is that a great number of votes, in a sense, go to loss. If you are, let's say, if you vote Labour or you vote Democrat in an area where your party got 25% of the votes, but the other party got 28% of the votes, it means that you don't have any representation in that area at all. Because the other guy got in, the other guy got a few more percent of votes, but then, of course, a very real question is asked, what gives the system the right to determine that someone with as much as a quarter or even more of the votes doesn't have any representation? So the British and the American systems are very non-proportional, while the Israeli system is very proportional. But let's turn it around the other way and say, what do the British and American systems give you that the Israeli system doesn't have? The British and the American systems give you fairly stable government. They normally create what is known as a two-party system. In the United States, the Republicans, the Democrats. In Britain, the Conservatives and the Labour Party. Although in Britain, there's also the Liberal Democrats, and there's now this new party, UKIP, who are challenging and could well take some votes, could well take some seats. But in the majority of cases, it becomes a two-party system where one party forms the government and the other party forms the opposition. In some rare cases, such as the last government in Britain, they've had to have a coalition with one other party, with the Liberal Democrats, just to make sure they get more than half the number of seats necessary of the 650 to form a majority government. So you have very stable government. Israel, unfortunately, you have very unstable government, because what happens after an election is, even after the recent election, where there are fewer parties than the past, there are still 7, 8, 9, even 10 parties who have got seats in the Knesset. The two largest parties, the very largest party of Likud has 28 seats. Okay, it's called the largest party, but doesn't even have a quarter of the seats. The next largest party, the Labour Party, has 23 seats. And there are quite a number of parties who have anything between 10 to 15 seats. So in order to get a majority government together, Netanyahu, as the leader of the largest party, has to wheel and deal with a whole myriad of smaller parties, 4 or 5 parties, each of which has different interests, political interests, social interests, which may conflict with each other, in order to ensure that he can get 61, which is of course necessary, the minimum necessary because there are 120 seats, that he can get at least 61 seats together to form a government. And until he does so, the whole of the country is in limbo. There have been elections. We had a 3-month election campaign. Election campaigns for a small country are amazingly long in Israel. We had a 3-month election campaign. We've already gone over a month since the elections. It could take anything up to another month to put the government together. From the moment an election is announced, and there again, it's not like the United States where you know every 4 years on the second Tuesday of the month of November,